The stranger in town. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the phone rang. I was sitting in my living room, sipping on a cup of coffee and reading the morning paper. The sun was just beginning to peek through the curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the room. My husband, Mark, had already left for work, and I was enjoying the peaceful silence of the house. The ringing phone shattered that peace. I set down my coffee and reached for the phone, wondering who could be calling so early. When I answered, I was greeted by a voice that would change my life forever. "Is this Mrs. Wilson?" The voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. There was something about the tone of the voice that made me uneasy. "This is Street Mary's hospital," the voice continued. "There's blood in your daughter's car." I felt the world around me spin. What? What do you mean? Is she okay? Where is she? "Ma'am, your daughter isn't here. The police found her car abandoned on the side of the road just outside of town. They brought it to the hospital to check for any evidence. We found blood inside, but there's no sign of your daughter." My heart stopped. No, this can't be happening. "Are you sure it's her car? Maybe there's been a mistake." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson. The car matches the description you gave us when you reported it missing this morning." My mind raced. My daughter, Emily, had asked me about a stranger in town the day before. She had seemed worried, anxious even. I had brushed it off, thinking it was just a passing concern. Now, I regretted not taking her more seriously. "I'm coming to the hospital," I said, grabbing my keys and rushing to the door. As I drove to the hospital, my thoughts were a whirlwind. How could this have happened? Just yesterday, Emily was at home, safe and sound. We had talked about her upcoming college applications and the possibility of a summer trip. Now she was missing, and there was blood in her car. The fear gnawed at my insides, making it hard to breathe. When I arrived at the hospital, I was greeted by a detective named Anderson. He was a tall man with a stern face, his expression unreadable. He led me to a small, dimly lit room where they had brought Emily's car. My stomach turned when I saw the bloodstains on the passenger seat. "Do you have any idea where she might be?" Detective Anderson asked, his voice calm but firm. "No," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "She was home last night. We talked about a stranger she saw in town, but I didn't think anything of it. I should have listened to her." The detective's expression softened slightly. "We're doing everything we can to find her. But there's something you need to know. 2 other girls were brought to the hospital this morning. Both in different parts of the city. They were found in off areas, badly beaten, but alive. We're trying to see if there's any connection between them and your daughter. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What does that mean? Do you think someone took her? We don't know yet. But the fact that there are two other girls in similar situations is concerning. We're investigating all leads. I nodded, unable to speak. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the weight of the situation pressing down on my chest. My little girl was out there somewhere, and I had no idea if she was hurt, scared, or worse. As the hours passed, the hospital became a blur of police officers, doctors, and concerned family members. I was given a place to sit in the waiting area, but I couldn't sit still. My mind kept replaying the conversation I had with Emily the day before. She had come home from school looking troubled, her usually bright eyes clouded with worry. "Mom," she had said, "there's a guy in town who's been hanging around the school. I've seen him a few times now, and he's always watching us." I had frowned, but I hadn't thought much of it. "Are you sure it's not just a coincidence? Maybe he's waiting for someone." Emily had shaken her head. "No, it's more than that. He gives me a bad feeling, like he's up to something." I had hugged her, trying to ease her fears. "I'm sure it's nothing, sweetie. But if it bothers you, we can talk to the school about it." She had nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Now, as I sat in that cold, sterile hospital, I wished I had taken her more seriously. Maybe if I had, she wouldn't be missing. Detective Anderson returned after what felt like an eternity. He sat down next to me, his face grave. "We've identified the other two girls. They're both students at the same school as your daughter." My heart sank. "Do you think this is connected to the stranger she mentioned?" "It's possible," he said. "But we need more information. Did Emily ever describe this man to you? Did she say anything else about him?" I tried to remember every detail of our conversation, but my mind was foggy with fear. She said he was tall, with dark hair. He was always wearing a baseball cap, so she couldn't see his face very well. But she said he seemed out of place, like he didn't belong there. The detective nodded, taking notes. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, we've put out a notice to all units to be on the lookout for anyone matching that description. We're also going through surveillance footage from around the school." I nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. Maybe they would find something, a clue that would lead them to Emily. But as the hours dragged on, that hope began to fade. The minutes felt like hours, and the hours felt like days. Every time the phone rang or a doctor walked by, my heart would leap into my throat, only to sink back down when there was no news. As night fell, I was allowed to go home, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the hospital. What if they found her while I was gone? What if she needed me? So I stayed, pacing the waiting room, praying for any news. It was early the next morning when Detective Anderson returned, his face pale and tense. "We found something," he said quietly. "We need you to come with us." My legs felt like jelly as I followed him out of the hospital and into his car. We drove in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. I tried to prepare myself for what I might see, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight that awaited us. We arrived at an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was dilapidated, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. My heart raced as we approached the entrance, the cold morning air biting at my skin. Inside, the warehouse was dark and musty, the only light coming from the flashlights the officers carried. We made our way through the maze of debris and broken furniture until we reached a small room in the back. The door was slightly ajar, and the detective pushed it open, revealing a scene that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Emily was there, lying on the cold, concrete floor. Her clothes were torn, and her face was bruised and bloodied. But she was alive. Barely. I rushed to her side, tears streaming down my face. "Emily." "Oh, my God, Emily." She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze unfocused. "Mom," she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here," I sobbed, cradling her in my arms. "You're going to be okay. We're going to get you out of here." The paramedics arrived shortly after, carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. I followed them out of the warehouse, my heart breaking with every step. How could this have happened? How could someone do this to my little girl? At the hospital, Emily was rushed into surgery, and I was left waiting once again, this time with the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the image of her lying there, so fragile and broken. The doctors assured me they were doing everything they could, but the uncertainty was unbearable. Hours passed, and finally, a doctor emerged from the operating room. His expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "She's stable," he said. "It was touch and go for a while, but she's a fighter. She's going to need time to heal, both physically and emotionally, but she's going to make it." I broke down in tears, the relief overwhelming me. Thank you so much." The doctor nodded, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "She's a strong girl. And she's going to need you more than ever now." I knew he was right. Emily had been through something horrific, something that would take time to heal from. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. As the days turned into weeks, Emily slowly began to recover. She didn't talk much about what had happened, and I didn't press her. The police were still investigating, but so far, they had no leads on the stranger in town. Emily's nightmares were the worst part. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, her eyes wide with terror. I would rush to her side, holding her as she sobbed, but she couldn't tell me what she was dreaming about. The trauma had buried itself deep within her, and I didn't know how to help her bring it to the surface. One night, a few weeks after she was discharged from the hospital, she finally spoke about what had happened. We were sitting in her room, the only light coming from the lamp on her nightstand. The shadows danced on the walls, and the air was thick with silence. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. I remember what happened that night. I turned to her, my heart pounding. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," I said, my voice gentle. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "No, I need to tell you. I need to remember." I took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "Okay, sweetheart. I'm here. You can tell me anything." She took a deep breath, her gaze distant as she began to recount the events of that fateful night. "I was driving home from the library," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had stayed late to study, and it was getting dark. I was almost home when I saw him, the man I told you about. He was standing by the side of the road, just outside of town. I tried to drive past him, but he stepped into the road, forcing me to stop." My grip on her hand tightened as I listened, my heart aching with every word. "He came up to my window and knocked on it," she continued, her voice shaking. I didn't want to roll it down, but I didn't know what else to do. He looked so normal, so calm, but there was something in his eyes that scared me. He asked if I could give him a ride into town. I didn't want to, but I was too scared to say no. I felt a lump forming in my throat as I imagined my daughter sitting there, terrified and alone. "I let him in the car," she said, her voice barely audible. "He seemed nice at first, making small talk, but then he started asking weird questions. He wanted to know if I lived alone, if I had a boyfriend, things like that. I lied and told him I wasn't alone, that my dad was at home waiting for me. But he didn't believe me." Tears streamed down her face as she continued. "He started getting angry, saying that he knew I was lying. He grabbed my arm, and I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. I managed to pull the car over, and I tried to run, but he caught me. He dragged me into that warehouse and She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as she cried. My heart ached for her, for the pain and fear she had endured. I wanted to take it all away, to make it better, but I knew I couldn't. All I could do was be there for her, to help her heal in whatever way I could. Eventually, her sobs subsided, and she pulled away, wiping her eyes. I thought I was going to die, she whispered. But then I heard sirens. He panicked and ran, leaving me there. That's when they found me. I nodded, my own tears falling freely now. You're so brave, Emily. You survived something horrible, and you're still here. I'm so proud of you. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I don't want him to get away with this, Mom. I want to help the police find him. I felt a surge of pride in my daughter. Despite everything she had been through, she was still strong, still willing to fight. We'll do whatever it takes, I promised her. We'll make sure he's caught and that he can't hurt anyone else. The next day, Emily and I went to the police station. Detective Anderson was there, and when Emily told him she wanted to help, he was both surprised and impressed. They arranged for her to work with a sketch artist to create a composite image of the man who had attacked her. It was a long and difficult process, but Emily was determined. She wanted to remember every detail, no matter how painful. When the sketch was finally complete, it was distributed to all the local media outlets, and the police began canvassing the area where Emily had last seen the man. Tips began to pour in, but none of them led to any solid leads. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and the case seemed to go cold. Emily tried to return to her normal life, but the fear lingered. Every time she saw a man who looked even remotely like the one in the sketch, she would freeze, her heart racing. It was clear that she was still haunted by what had happened. One evening, as we were having dinner, the phone rang. I answered it, expecting it to be a telemarketer or one of Mark's colleagues. But when I heard Detective Anderson's voice on the other end, my heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Wilson, we've found him," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need you and Emily to come down to the station." I relayed the message to Emily, and we quickly got in the car and drove to the police station. When we arrived, Detective Anderson met us in the lobby, his expression serious. "We received an anonymous tip earlier today," he explained as he led us to an interrogation room. A man matching the description in the sketch was spotted at a motel just outside of town. When we arrived, he was there, and we brought him in for questioning. "We need Emily to confirm if he's the one." Emily's face paled, but she nodded bravely. "I'll do it." The detective led us to a room with a one-way mirror, where we could see the man sitting inside the interrogation room. He looked just like the sketch, tall, with dark hair, wearing a baseball cap. Emily's hand trembled as she looked at him, but she didn't hesitate. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's the man who attacked me." Detective Anderson nodded, satisfied. "We'll take it from here." "You did great, Emily." As we left the station, I could see a mixture of relief and fear in Emily's eyes. The man who had haunted her nightmares was finally behind bars, but the scars he had left on her would take much longer to heal. In the days that followed, the news broke that the man had confessed not only to attacking Emily, but also to the assaults on the other two girls who had been found in the hospital. He was a drifter, moving from town to town, targeting young women who were alone. He had no known address, no family, and no real identity. He was, in every sense of the word, a stranger. The relief of his capture was bittersweet. While it brought some closure, it couldn't erase the trauma Emily had endured. But I was determined to help her heal, to support her in any way I could. As the weeks turned into months, Emily began to regain some semblance of normalcy. She returned to school, resumed her studies, and even began to see a therapist to help her process what had happened. She was slowly rebuilding her life, piece by piece. One day, as we sat together in the living room, Emily turned to me and said, "Mom, I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to do something to help other girls who might be in the same situation I was in." I smiled at her, my heart swelling with pride. "What do you want to do?" "I want to start a self-defense class at school," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "I want to make sure that no one else has to go through what I went through." I hugged her tightly, amazed by her strength and resilience. "That's a wonderful idea, Emily. I'm so proud of you." And so, Emily began her journey of healing by helping others. She worked with the school to set up a self-defense program, teaching other girls how to protect themselves and stay safe. It was a small step, but it was a powerful one.